James Reed stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over Manhattan. His reflection stared back at him, expensive suit, perfectly trimmed beard, and eyes that hadn't known real sleep in 3 weeks. Not since Maya left. The penthouse felt too big now. Too quiet. Funny how a space designed for one person could suddenly feel so empty when that one special person decided not to visit anymore. He checked his phone for the 100th time that day. No messages, no calls. He scrolled to their last exchange and read it again, even though the words were already burned into his memory. "I deserve someone who sees me as an equal, not an accessory to your success story," she had written. "When you figure out the difference, let me know." James placed his hand against the cool glass of the window. 20 floors below, normal life continued. People heading home to families, to lovers, to someone who cared if they made it through the door. Mr. Reed, his house manager, Gloria, appeared in the doorway. "Your dinner is ready. Would you like it in the dining room or?" "I'm not hungry," he said, not turning from the window. Gloria had been with him for 7 years. She'd seen him through business victories, market crashes, and health scares. But she'd never seen him like this, lost, unfocused, a man whose world had stopped spinning. "You haven't eaten properly in days, sir," she said gently. "Dr. Chen called again to check on your blood pressure medication." James waved his hand dismissively. "Tell him I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Anyone could see that. The man who controlled a technology empire worth billions couldn't figure out how to fix the one thing money couldn't buy. When the elevator doors had closed on Maya 3 weeks ago, she'd taken something with her. Something he hadn't known was possible to lose. He moved to his desk where a single-framed photo sat among the expensive gadgets and awards. It showed them on a beach in Bali, laughing, her beautiful dark skin glowing in the sunset, his arms wrapped around her waist, her natural hair blowing in the breeze. She had been so relaxed there, so happy. Before the fight started, before his work consumed everything. James picked up the photo, remembering how they'd met. A medical technology conference in Chicago. She wasn't impressed by him. That's what had caught him off guard. Dr. Maya Collins, brilliant neuroscientist and researcher, had challenged his company's approach to medical AI ethics right in the middle of his keynote speech. "Your algorithms are reinforcing racial biases in treatment recommendations," she had said, standing tall in the audience. "And your paper doesn't address it." Instead of being offended, he'd been fascinated. She spoke with such conviction, such clarity. When he invited her to continue the discussion over coffee, she agreed, but made it clear she wasn't interested in his money or connections, just a professional conversation, she had said firmly. That professional conversation stretched into dinner, then into weeks of phone calls, then months of a relationship that made him feel, for the first time, like someone saw past his bank account to the person underneath. Maya had grown up working class, the daughter of Jamaican immigrants who'd sacrificed everything for her education. While he'd been building companies in his 20s, she'd been working night shifts at hospitals to pay for grad school. Her achievements were earned through pure talent and determination. "You can't just throw money at every problem, James," she'd told him during their last big fight. "Some things require actual emotional work, actual time and attention." He'd been distracted that night, his mind on a product launch in Singapore. "I hear you," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "Let's talk about it later." But Maya had reached over and closed his laptop. "There is no later. That's exactly the problem. There's always another deal, another meeting, another emergency that's more important than us." "That's not fair," he protested. "My work makes you billions." "I know." Her voice had been tired, not angry. That was worse somehow. "But what's the point of all this success if you can't be present for one evening with the woman you say you love?" The argument spiraled from there. Words were said. Truths that had been simmering below the surface finally boiled over. Now, looking at the photo, James realized she had been right. He'd built an empire but forgotten to build a life worth sharing. For all his business genius, he'd somehow missed the most important investment of all, loving someone properly, consistently, present in both body and mind. He put the picture down and walked to his home office, where his assistant had left stacks of contracts requiring his signature. At the top was the acquisition paperwork for a small medical research firm in Boston, Maya's hometown. He'd pursued the deal because the technology complemented his company's portfolio, but now the coincidence felt like the universe taunting him. James pushed the papers aside and opened his computer. If he couldn't sleep, he might as well work. But instead of checking the stock market or reading reports, he found himself typing Maya's name into the search bar. Her latest research publication appeared. A breakthrough study on neural pathways that could help stroke victims recover speech. His chest tightened with pride, then with loss. She was extraordinary, and he had let her walk away because he couldn't step away from his empire long enough to show her she mattered more. For the first time in his adult life, James Reed, the man who had solutions for everything, had no idea what to do next. James did something the next morning that he hadn't done in 5 years. He cancelled all his meetings, not rescheduled, cancelled. Cancel everything for the week, he told his executive assistant, Olivia, over the phone. The silence on the other end was so complete he thought the call had dropped. Everything? Olivia finally asked. The board meeting? The investor call from Tokyo? The product strategy? All of it, James said, his voice firm. Tell them I'm dealing with a personal matter. Another silence. In 15 years working together, James had never prioritized personal matters over business. Not when his father died. Not when he had pneumonia so bad he attended conference calls from his hospital bed. Are you? Olivia hesitated. Are you all right, sir? James looked around his home office at the life he built. Awards lined the walls. Magazine covers featuring his face. Technology that had changed how the world worked. No, he said simply. I'm not. After hanging up, he did something else unexpected. He opened his laptop and searched how to win back someone you love. The results were overwhelming. Relationship coaches, books, podcasts, YouTube videos with titles like 5 Guaranteed Ways to Make Her Come Back that make him cringe. He felt ridiculous. Here he was, a man who could close billion-dollar deals, who had teams of people analyzing every business move, and he was Googling relationship advice like a teenager. Yet he kept searching. By afternoon, his coffee table was cluttered with notes. By evening, he downloaded 3 books on emotional intelligence and started a therapy podcast recommended by thousands of listeners. When Olivia arrived at his penthouse the next morning, carrying the urgent papers he needed to sign, she found him surrounded by books with titles like Attached and Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Dark circles hung under his eyes. His usually perfect hair was uncombed. He looked up and blinked, as if surprised to see her. You've never cancelled a board meeting before, she said, setting down her bag. I've worked for you since you were running the company out of that tiny office in Brooklyn. Even when you had that kidney stone attack, you made me bring the quarterly reports to the ER. James rubbed his temples. I messed up, Olivia, with Maya. I really messed up. Olivia's expression softened. She'd met Dr. Collins several times, had noticed how her boss changed around the neuroscientist, laughed more, checked his phone less. These might help more than those books, she said gently, nodding toward the relationship self-help guides. She pulled up a chair. Tell me what happened. For the next hour, James talked, really talked. About the fight. About how he prioritized everything above Maya. About how empty his massive success felt without someone to share it with. You know what she said before she left? James ran his hand through his unkempt hair. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your work. I'm asking you to make space for both. He shook his head. And I couldn't even do that. Olivia listened, then said something no one had said to James in years. Maybe you need help. Real help, not just business coaching. Across town, Maya sat in her university lab, staring at brain scans that should have had her full attention. 3 weeks since she'd walked out of James's penthouse, and still her mind kept drifting back to him. Dr. Collins. Her research assistant, Wei, waved a hand in front of her face. The data you asked for? Sorry, Maya said, taking the tablet. Just distracted. Wei hesitated. Is it about that billionaire guy? The one whose company keeps calling about collaborating with our lab? Maya's head snapped up. What? His company's been calling? Almost every day. Something about funding for the neural interface project. Maya felt her stomach tighten. Was this James's way of trying to stay connected? Using business as an excuse? Later that evening, her best friend Camille came over with takeout and wine. They sat on Maya's small balcony overlooking the city, and Maya finally let herself really talk about James. "The crazy thing is, I miss him," she admitted, swirling her wine. "Not the fancy trips or restaurants. Just him. The real him. The guy who would get so excited explaining some new technology that he'd talk with his mouth full. Who secretly watched cooking shows at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep." Camille studied her friend. "You know, most women would be throwing a party if a billionaire was chasing after them." Maya laughed without humor. "You know, that's not who I am. I don't care about his money." "Maybe that's why he fell for you," Camille said thoughtfully. "In his world, everyone wants something from him. Except you." Maya stared out at the skyline, at the building where James's company headquarters dominated the view. "I just wanted him. Present. Engaged. Willing to build something real, not just another business asset." "Maybe you should start dating again," Camille suggested. "There's that neurosurgeon at your hospital who keeps asking about you." Maya shook her head. "It's not about finding someone new. It's about understanding why I fell for someone who couldn't prioritize love alongside ambition," she sighed. "Why we keep circling these same patterns." What neither James nor Maya realized was that their separation was forcing both to confront truths they'd been avoiding. For James, it was the realization that his drive for success had become a shield against real intimacy. For Maya, it was understanding that her independence, born from years of self-reliance, sometimes made it hard to accept love when it was offered. As night fell across the city, they'd both lay awake in separate homes, staring at their ceilings. Both wondering if what they'd lost was truly gone forever, or if there was a way to find each other again, not as a powerful man and the woman who caught his eye, but as two people brave enough to grow together. 2 months had passed. The morning air was crisp as Maya walked across the university campus toward her research building. Her mind was already racing with the day's tasks. A meeting with graduate students, reviewing grant applications, analyzing the latest trial results. She pushed through the double doors, nodding at the security guard who'd been there since she was a PhD student. The familiar routine of badging in, taking the elevator to the 3rd floor, and walking down the long corridor to her lab. Except today, something was different. As Maya swiped her keycard at the lab door, she heard voices inside, excited, surprised voices. She frowned. Her team wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour. The door swung open and Maya froze. Her laboratory had transformed overnight. Where there had been outdated equipment and makeshift workstations now stood cutting-edge technology. New neural imaging systems. Advanced computer workstations. The kind of sit-up she'd been requesting university funding for over 3 years. Her research assistant Wei rushed over, face flushed with excitement. "Dr. Collins, did you know about this? We came in early and found everything. Look at this scanner. It's the prototype everyone's been talking about. It's not even on the market yet." Maya touched the nearest machine, a brand new neural mapping system she only read about in journals. "I don't understand," she murmured. "Our funding request was denied last quarter." "How did?" Then she saw the envelope on her desk, her name written in familiar handwriting. Her heart jumped to her throat as she picked it up, slid her finger under the seal, and pulled out a single note card. "Your work deserves to be supported. No strings attached. J." Maya sat down heavily in her chair. She knew instantly. Only one person had both the resources and the insight into her research needs to make this happen. James. Dr. Collins? Wei was watching her. "Are you okay?" Maya nodded, unable to speak. The gesture was grand, extravagant even. Typical James. But the note, that part felt different. No expectations, no public recognition, just support for her work, regardless of their personal relationship. That evening, Maya's phone rang while she was still at the lab, running tests on the new equipment. She glanced at the screen, her stomach flipping when she saw James's name. She hesitated, then answered, "Hello." "Maya," his voice sounded different, less confident than she remembered. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." The line went quiet. Years of building companies, making million-dollar deals, and suddenly he seemed at a loss for words. "Thank you for the equipment," Maya said finally. "It's incredible. My team is over the moon." "I'm not trying to buy you back," James said quickly, the words tumbling out. "I know that's not who you are. That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" Maya asked quietly. Another pause. "Your research matters. It should have the backing it deserves, regardless of us. This isn't conditional on anything. It's yours, whether you ever want to speak to me again or not." Maya traced her finger along the edge of her desk. "Equipment doesn't fix what broke between us, James." "I know," he replied, his voice softer now. "Nothing simple could. That's why I've started therapy. Real therapy, not just executive coaching. Twice a week for the past 6 weeks." This caught her off guard. James had always dismissed therapy as paying someone to tell you what you already know. "You're seeing a therapist?" "I'm trying to understand why I keep people at arm's length," he continued. "Even those I care about most. Why work became my hiding place. It's not easy facing yourself, but I'm trying." The vulnerability in his voice was something she'd rarely heard. This wasn't the James who controlled every situation with his wealth and influence. This was someone struggling, fighting to change. "I don't expect anything," he added when she didn't immediately respond. "I just wanted you to know." After they hung up, Maya sat in her lab for a long time, watching the lights of the city come on through the window. The equipment was useful, game-changing for her research, in fact. But it was the therapy, the willingness to look inward, that gave her pause. Across town, James put down his phone and looked at his therapist, Dr. Liu, who sat across from him in her simply furnished office. No couch, just 2 comfortable chairs. "I called her," he said, running his hands through his hair. "About the equipment." Dr. Liu nodded. "And how did that feel?" "Terrifying," he admitted. "More scary than when I risked everything on my first company. More than when the market crashed and I almost lost it all." "Why do you think that is?" she asked, her voice calm. James stared out the window. "Because I can't control the outcome. I've spent my whole life controlling everything, calculating risks, making backup plans. But with Maya," he shook his head. "There's no strategy that guarantees success. There's just me trying to be better. And that might not be enough." Dr. Liu smiled slightly. "That's an important realization, James. Relationships aren't business deals. You can't ensure outcomes with the right investment." He nodded, uncomfortable with how exposed he felt. 6 weeks of therapy had begun to peel back layers he hadn't known existed. Childhood wounds from his father's constant criticism, the abandonment by his mother when he was 9, his pattern of keeping emotional distance while using wealth to keep people close, but not too close. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked suddenly. "At my age, after a lifetime of habits." Dr. Liu considered this. "Change isn't an event, it's a process. The question isn't whether you can change completely overnight. It's whether you're willing to take one step forward today and another tomorrow, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." Later that night, in his silent penthouse, James opened his laptop. Instead of checking stock prices or company reports, he began typing an email to his board of directors. Subject line: "Restructuring executive responsibilities." For the first time in 15 years, he was creating space in his life for something besides work. He had no idea if Maya would ever give him another chance, but whether she did or not, he was beginning to understand that the life he built was missing its foundation. "Tell me about your father," Dr. Liu said as James settled into the now familiar chair in her office. 3 months into therapy, and these sessions had become the most challenging part of his week, more difficult than board meetings, more exhausting than investor pitches. James stared out the window. Rain tapped against the glass, matching his mood. What more was there to say? He was a hard man. Expected perfection. Nothing was ever good enough. "You've told me what he was like," Dr. Liu nodded, "but not how it felt to be his son." The question caught James off guard. He'd spent decades analyzing his father's business strategies, even adopting some as his own. But the feelings, those he'd buried so deep he wasn't sure he could find them anymore. "Lonely," he said finally, surprising himself with the answer. It felt lonely. For the next hour, James spoke about growing up as the only child of a demanding father and a mother who left when he was 9. About learning early that accomplishments earned brief approval, while mistakes brought lasting disappointment. About the day his college acceptance letter arrived and his father's only comment was, "Now the real work begins." "I promised myself I'd be different," James said, his voice thick. "That I'd build something he couldn't criticize, something so successful he'd have to admit I was worthy." He laughed without humor. "And here I am, worth billions and still feeling like that kid trying to earn approval." Dr. Liu watched him carefully. "And how does this connect to your relationship with Maya?" James ran his hands over his face. "I keep everyone at a safe distance. Relationships with clear transactions. I provide financial security, they provide whatever it is they provide." "But Maya," he shook his head. "She wanted the one thing I don't know how to give, real connection." "And that frightened you," Dr. Liu said, not a question. "Terrified me," James admitted, "still does." Later that week, James did something unprecedented. He called his company's head of human resources and announced a new policy, mandatory breaks for all employees, including executives. No more 80-hour work weeks, no more missed vacations, no more glorifying burnout. "People need balance," he told the stunned HR director. "They need lives outside these walls. I've been doing it wrong all these years." The policy sent shockwaves through the company. Some board members grumbled about losing the company culture. James stood firm. "If our culture depends on people sacrificing their personal lives, then it deserves to be lost." He started leaving the office by 6 p.m. most days. At first he felt almost guilty, as if he were playing hooky. But gradually he discovered something unexpected. The world didn't fall apart when he wasn't constantly working. In fact, his leadership team stepped up, making decisions that sometimes were better than the ones he would have made. One evening, instead of going straight home to his empty penthouse, James walked through the park. No security detail, no driver waiting. Just a man in a slightly too expensive coat, watching children play as the sun set. A small girl, maybe 40 years old, accidentally kicked her ball toward him. James picked it up, smiling as she ran over. "Thank you, mister," she said, taking the ball. Her mother called her back, eyeing James warily until he stepped away. He couldn't blame her. In this city, you taught your children to be careful of strangers. The interaction lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it stayed with him. That little girl didn't care about his net worth or his company's stock price. To her, he was just a man in the park who'd picked up a ball. Who was he, really, without all the trappings of success? Across town, Maya received an unexpected text from Jenny, James's younger sister, with whom she'd maintained a friendship despite the breakup. "Coffee tomorrow," it read. "Just us girls. No spy mission for my brother, promise." Maya smiled, then texted back in agreement. She'd always liked Jenny, down to earth, despite growing up with wealth, and refreshingly honest. The next day, they met at a small cafe far from both James' office and Maya's lab. After catching up on Jenny's art gallery and Maya's research, the conversation inevitably turned to James. "He's different," Jenny said, stirring her latte. "I've known him my whole life, and I've never seen him like this, questioning everything, especially himself." "People don't change overnight," Maya replied, more gently than she'd intended. "You're right," Jenny agreed. "But real change starts somewhere." She hesitated. "He's not just going to therapy, he's connecting with old friends. Having actual conversations that aren't about business. Last week he asked about my feelings, my actual feelings. Nearly fell off my chair." Maya laughed despite herself. "That doesn't sound like the James I knew." "Maybe that's the point," Jenny said. "He's not the same James. The question is whether you're willing to see who he's becoming." Later, walking home, Maya found herself mulling over Jenny's words. She'd spent 3 months telling herself that people don't change, that their breakup was inevitable given who James was. But what if he really was changing? And what did that mean for her? Maya had her own journey happening in parallel. Weekly dinners with her parents had become a ritual again, reminding her of her roots. She'd started a mentoring program for young women in science from backgrounds like hers, and she'd been reflecting on her own patterns, how her fierce independence, born from years of self-reliance, sometimes made it difficult to let people in. That night, Maya found herself looking at old photos of her and James. Not the fancy charity galas or exotic vacations, but the simple moments, making breakfast together on a Sunday morning, laughing over a board game, the way he'd sometimes fall asleep with his head in her lap while she read research papers. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to wonder if there might be a path forward, not picking up where they left off, but starting something new, with two people who were doing the hard work of becoming better versions of themselves. The invitation arrived in Maya's email on a Tuesday morning. The annual Neuroscience Innovation Gala, the biggest fundraising event for medical research in the city. She'd attended the past 3 years, representing her university. This year would be no different, except James would definitely be there. His company was always a major sponsor. Maya stared at the invitation, her finger hovering over the accept button. Part of her wanted to decline to avoid the awkwardness. Another part, a part she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge, wanted to see him again. She clicked accept before she could change her mind. The night of the gala arrived, unusually warm for spring. Maya stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down the deep blue dress she'd splurged on. Her mother had always told her that certain occasions called for armor, and tonight she needed to feel confident. "You look stunning," her roommate Tina said from the doorway. "That man won't know what hit him." Maya smiled nervously. "This isn't about James." Tina raised an eyebrow. "Sure it's not." The ballroom of the Grand Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the jewelry of the city's wealthiest philanthropists. Maya moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with colleagues, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. She scanned the room, telling herself she wasn't looking for anyone in particular. And then, across the crowded space, their eyes met. James stood near the stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. But something was different. The confident, almost intimidating presence she remembered had softened somehow. He looked nervous. He made his way toward her, stopping to shake hands and exchange pleasantries, but his eyes kept finding hers, as if making sure she was still there. "You look beautiful," he said simply when he finally reached her. "You look tired," Maya replied, noticing the new lines around his eyes. He laughed, a genuine sound that caught her off guard. "Turns out confronting your demons isn't conducive to beauty sleep." The honesty in his voice cracked something open between them, a tiny window through the wall they'd built after the breakup. "How have you been?" he asked. "Busy," she said. "The new equipment has accelerated our research significantly. We're seeing patterns in neural responses that we couldn't detect before." "I'd love to hear about it," he said, and the surprising thing was he seemed to mean it. A waiter announced dinner was about to be served. James glanced toward the head table where the event organizers were gathering. "I'm supposed to sit up there," he said, gesturing. "But there's a quiet balcony off the east side of the ballroom. Maybe we could talk?" After the speeches. Maya hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." The speeches dragged on. Wealthy donors congratulating themselves on their generosity, researchers explaining their work in carefully simplified terms. Maya found herself watching James instead of listening. He sat at the head table, nodding politely, but his attention seemed elsewhere. Once he caught her looking and smiled slightly. When the formal program ended and the band started playing, Maya slipped away from her table and found the glass doors leading to the balcony James had mentioned. The night air was cool after the warmth of the crowded ballroom. City lights stretched before her, a carpet of stars below matching the ones above. The door opened behind her. "Sorry that took so long," James said. Donors always want to talk about investment opportunities when they've had champagne. They stood side by side at the balcony rail, a careful foot of space between them. The silence should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. "I've been seeing Dr. Liu for 5 months now," James said finally. "She's good. Doesn't let me hide behind my usual deflections." Maya turned to look at him. "And what have you learned?" "That I've spent my whole life using work as a shield," he said quietly. "That I push people away before they can leave me, like my mother did. That I use money to create the illusion of connection without the vulnerability of real intimacy." He shook his head. "Sorry, that was a lot at once." "No," Maya said. "It's good, real." For the next hour, they talked without pretense. James shared revelations from his therapy, how his fear of abandonment had made him keep emotional distance while using his wealth to maintain control, how he'd restructured his company to prevent burnout, not just for himself, but for everyone. Maya listened, then shared her own insights, how her determination to prove herself had sometimes made her reject support that came with genuine care, not just from him, but from everyone. How she'd been reconnecting with her roots, mentoring young women who reminded her of herself at their age. "I'm not the same person I was when we broke up," James said as the gala inside began winding down. "I can't promise I won't mess up again. I'm still learning, still figuring this out, but I'm trying." Maya watched his face in the soft glow from the ballroom lights. The man she'd fallen for was still there, but there was something new too, a willingness to be vulnerable that she hadn't seen before. "I'm not asking for anything," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "But I'd like to show you who I'm becoming if you're willing to see it." Maya thought about the past 5 months, the pain of their breakup, the unexpected growth it had forced on both of them, the separate journeys that had perhaps prepared them for a new kind of connection. "Friendship first," she said finally. "That's all I can offer right now." Relief and hope flickered across his face. "That's more than I deserve," he replied. As they walked back into the ballroom, they didn't touch, didn't make promises. But something had shifted. A door cracked open to possibility, to two people seeing each other not just as they had been, but as they were becoming. "We're under attack." The words came from Philip, James's chief financial officer, bursting into his office without knocking. 2 weeks had passed since the gala, since that careful conversation with Maya on the balcony. They'd texted a few times since then, nothing deep, just checking in. Baby steps toward whatever they might become. "What do you mean, under attack?" James asked, looking up from his computer. Philip's face was pale. "Global tech is making a move. They've been quietly buying shares through shell companies for months. They just announced a hostile takeover bid." James felt his stomach drop. Global Tech was their biggest competitor, run by a notoriously ruthless CEO who'd made no secret of wanting to dismantle James's company and absorb its most profitable divisions. "Call an emergency board meeting," James said, his mind already racing through scenarios, defense strategies, counter moves, "and get the leadership team in the conference room now." As Philip left, James checked his watch. He was supposed to meet Maya for coffee in 2 hours, their first planned get-together since agreeing to rebuild their friendship. He picked up his phone, then set it down again without texting her. He needed to focus completely on this crisis. The old James would have disappeared into work mode without a second thought. Meetings would run into the night. Days would blend together. Personal commitments would be forgotten in the rush to protect what he built. 6 months ago, that's exactly what would have happened. But now, even as he walked into the emergency meeting with his leadership team, James made a decision. He would handle this crisis differently. The next 72 hours were a blur of strategy sessions, calls with major shareholders, and legal consultations. James slept maybe 4 hours total, working with his team to craft a response to the hostile takeover attempt. But in the midst of it all, he did something the old James would never have done. He kept his commitment to Maya. "I'd only have 30 minutes, he told her, meeting her at the coffee shop near her lab. "We're dealing with a situation at the company, but I wanted to see you." Maya studied his face, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't much," he admitted. "Global Tech is trying to take over the company. It's all hands on deck." "You should be at the office then," she said. "We can do this another time." James shook his head. "No, that's the old pattern. Work crisis erupts, personal connections get sacrificed." "I'm trying to find balance even now." He smiled tiredly, "especially now." That 30-minute coffee break turned into one of the most honest conversations they'd ever had. James shared his fears about potentially losing the company he built. Maya listened, offering perspective without trying to fix anything. When he had to leave, he made a promise. "I'll text you each day just to check in, even if it's just a sentence." And surprisingly, he kept that promise. Throughout 18-hour workdays and midnight strategy sessions, James found moments to send quick messages. "Still fighting. Had a good meeting with investors today. Legal team thinks we have a strong defense. How was your day? Running on coffee and determination. Thinking of you." Maya's replies were supportive but not demanding, understanding the pressure he was under while appreciating his efforts to maintain their connection. The true test came unexpectedly, not from the business crisis, but from a personal one. James was in the middle of a crucial video conference with international investors when his phone lit up with Maya's name. He almost ignored it. This call could determine whether key shareholders stayed with him or defected to global tech. But something made him glance at the message. My dad just had a heart attack. At University Hospital, not sure how bad. Without hesitation, James interrupted the call. I apologize, but I have a personal emergency. Philip will continue the presentation. Ignoring the surprised looks from his team, he walked out, already dialing Maya. I'm on my way, he said when she answered, hearing the strain in her voice. What can I do? You don't need to come, Maya said. I know you're in the middle of this takeover fight. I'm already in the elevator, James replied. Some things are more important. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Maya in the waiting room. Her usually confident posture crumbled with worry. Her mother sat nearby, speaking rapid Spanish into her phone, notifying family members. The doctors are with him now, Maya said when she saw James. They think it was a mild attack, but they're running tests. James didn't try to fix the situation with money or connections, didn't offer to fly in specialists or take over the hospital wing. Instead, he simply sat with her, holding her hand when she reached for his, bringing coffee for her mother, creating space for her to process her worry. When Maya's brother called from Chicago, panicking about not being able to get a flight until morning, James quietly arranged for his private jet to bring him to the city, not as a grand gesture, but as a practical solution offered without fanfare. My father always liked you, Maya said softly during a quiet moment in the waiting room. He said you had good eyes. James smiled. I like him too. He raised an amazing daughter. Later, as Maya's father rested comfortably, declared stable by the doctors, Maya found James in the hospital waiting room at 3 a.m., still there despite having stepped away multiple times for urgent calls about his company. You should go, she told him. Dad's okay, and your company needs you. James looked at her, the woman he'd lost through his own inability to balance work and love. The company will be there in the morning. Right now, I'm exactly where I need to be. In that sterile hospital waiting room, with its uncomfortable chairs and bad coffee, something shifted between them. A recognition that this wasn't for show, wasn't a performance to win her back. It was simply a man choosing to be present for someone he cared about, even when everything he'd built was under threat. The old James would have sent flowers and returned to work. This James stayed all night, his presence worth more than any grand gesture could ever be. 1 year had passed since their breakup. The seasons had changed, lives had shifted, and somehow they had found their way back to each other, not to where they'd been, but to somewhere new. James stood outside Abiba's, the small Ethiopian restaurant where he and Maya had their first date. He'd chosen it carefully, not one of the fancy restaurants where he usually entertained clients. This place had meaning, history. Inside, the warm scent of spices filled the air. The owner recognized James and smiled, leading him to the corner table he'd requested. Maya arrived 5 minutes later, wearing a simple green dress that made her eyes shine. You remembered, she said, looking around the restaurant. How could I forget? James replied. You told me I was eating injera all wrong and made me start over. Maya laughed. You were using a fork for Ethiopian food. They settled in, ordering the same sharing platter they'd had that first night. As they ate with their hands, Ethiopian style, from the same large plate, the familiar ritual brought back memories. Over the past year, they had rebuilt something between them, starting with friendship, then cautious dating. James had successfully fought off the takeover attempt, emerging with his company intact but changed. He'd restructured everything, creating a business that didn't demand his soul as payment for success. Maya's research had flourished. With the equipment James had provided and grants she'd secured on her own merit, her lab was now at the forefront of neural regeneration studies. Her father had recovered fully from his heart attack, and her mentoring program for young women in science had just received national recognition. I was thinking about something today, James said, breaking off a piece of injera bread. About who I was when we met, compared to now. Maya watched him, noticing how much more at ease he seemed in himself. The nervous energy that had always surrounded him like an aura had settled into something steadier, more grounded. This past year without you, then slowly finding our way back together, he continued, his voice soft but sure, has changed everything for me. I don't want to be the man who has everything but feels nothing. I want to be someone who can give and receive love without fear. Maya reached for her water, taking a moment. The money, the power, those were never what impressed me about you, James. It was your mind, your vision that caught my attention. Now I'm finally seeing your heart too. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, he acknowledged, meeting her eyes directly. But I can promise to remain committed to this journey, with or without you. Though I hope it's with you. Maya studied him in the warm light of the restaurant. She thought about their path, the hurt, the healing, the growth that might never have happened if they hadn't lost each other first. She reached across the table, her fingers intertwining with his. I'm not interested in perfection. I'm interested in someone who's willing to grow alongside me. Someone who sees me, really sees me. I do, James said, his eyes never leaving hers. Not as an accessory to my life, but as the extraordinary woman who challenges me to be better than my wealth, better than my success, better than I ever thought I could be. As they walked out of the restaurant later, hand in hand under the city lights, there were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just two people choosing each other, not from need or convenience, but from a place of growth, understanding, and genuine love. Their story wasn't about a billionaire winning back the woman he lost. It was about two people doing the hard work of becoming better versions of themselves, discovering that real love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about choosing each other, day after day, through the simple, ordinary magic of being truly seen.